Good evening and welcome to this conference on recession in Europe and implications for India and Southeast Asia. My name is Michael Mathiessen. I'm the visiting fellow from the European Union at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and US here in Singapore. That means I'm an EU official who has been allowed to come to Singapore for 10 months, and I'm halfway through and I enjoy it very much. I've been asked to moderate this conference where we have two institutes represented, ESSEC on this side and ISAS on this side, and towards the end of the conference our speakers will tell you more about the two institutes. The theme is, as I mentioned, recession in Europe and implications for India and Southeast Asia. And I think it's very appropriate that we have two Europeans and two Indians in the panel, and all four will speak, and I will give them the floor in a minute. Let me introduce tonight's speakers. To my right, Professor John Harris, who is a visiting research professor at ISAS, the Institute of South Asian Studies at the NUS, and he's a British national. I'm correctly informed. Yes. And Professor...
English, actually.
English, okay. You have to be very careful these days. Professor Harris is a social anthropologist and has his education from the University of Cambridge and University of East Anglia. He has taught at LSE, but in 2006 he moved to the Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, and was the first director of the university's New School of International Studies. And Professor Harris has a long-standing interest in politics and political economy in Southeast Asia and in India in particular. And if I'm well informed, you landed at 5 p.m. at Changi Airport from India. So we will make sure that you are awake throughout the conference. Also to my right, and also from ISAS, is Dr. Amitendu Palit, who is the head of partnerships and programs and a visiting senior research fellow at ISAS and US. And Dr. Palit carries an Indian passport. He is an economist specialized in comparative economic studies. He has worked in the Indian Ministry of Finance for more than a decade and has had a number of other consultancy posts and has published many books and is a columnist for various newspapers and has a special interest in trade. And we'll come back to that during the conference. If I turn to the left, to ESSEC Business School, I have Professor Sedomir Nestorovic, yes.
That's right.
Sorry for the pronunciation. Professor is here at ESSEC, carries a French passport, and has a doctorate in geopolitics from Sciences Po Paris, and is an author of many books and articles, and his specialty is international business and Islam and business. And last but not least, Professor Ashok Som, Associate Dean of Global MBA, carries an Indian passport, and he has a PhD in business administration from the Indian Institute of Management, and 2 masters, and his research area is international business. So with these presentations, I think we can start the debate in a minute, but being the EU visiting fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School, and being an EU official in Singapore and not belonging neither to ISAS or to ESSEC, I thought I should say a few words about the relationship between EU and India in order to put tonight's conference in a perspective. India and the European Union became strategic partners back in 2004. And as you may know, the European Union has a limited number of strategic partners, 10 in all. 4 of them are in Asia: China, Japan, India, and South Korea. When you are strategic partners, you meet at various levels, including at the summit level. And there have been EU-India summits for almost every year since this partnership was agreed. The last summit took place in February 2012 in New Delhi. And as you may know, with the Lisbon Treaty, which entered into force at the end of 2009, there is more continuity in the EU's representation vis-à-vis third states which means that it is now the President of the European Council, Mr. Van Rompuy, and the President of the European Commission, Mr. Barroso, who attend all the summits and meet third parties. That means it's no longer the rotating presidency which was changing every 6 months. Personally, I think this is an advantage. I hope third states think the same. There's a joke about an American president who, at a summit with the European Union, said, "Who's the guy in the middle?" He had never seen him before. So we had this system of changing every 6 months. And I think if you want to be strategic, you need personal contacts and you need continuity. And this is what we have more of with the Lisbon Treaty, when it's the same top politicians who are meeting with their Indian counterparts or Chinese counterparts or other counterparts. In that context, let me just highlight that this week in Brussels, in fact today, we have a meeting of foreign ministers and a meeting of European affairs ministers, but Thursday, Friday, there will be a European Council, one more, chaired by Mr. Van Rompuy, and of course they will discuss a number of economic issues due to the situation in Europe, the euro crisis or the sovereign debt crisis, but they also have on the agenda strategic partnerships. So this is interesting that the same people, Prime Minister Cameron, President Hollande, Chancellor Merkel, they discuss internal EU economic developments, and of course there's something to do there, but at the same time they discuss strategic partnerships. And the person who is chairing these meetings, and one of the key partners in the meetings, President Barroso, are then the two representatives of the EU traveling to India, to China, to Russia, to Japan, and so on. And I think this is something one should take into account. Maybe you don't really see the results of it, but what I hear from some of the strategic partners of the European Union, they appreciate this, to see the same people and to talk to the people who are really, you can say, involved in the crisis management that we are dealing with inside the European Union. The next summit between the EU and India is coming up soon. The date is not yet there, but it should be within the next few months. That brings me, of course, to the relationship between EU and India in the area of trade. As you may know, India is EU's 8th trading partner, according to my latest information, and the EU is India's largest trading partner, almost 100 billion euros. I'm not sure about the Singapore dollars, sorry, I haven't been here long enough. And the EU is the biggest investor in India. So of course there's a lot of interest in a forthcoming free trade agreement between the EU and India. There will be a lot of potential there. This has been negotiated since 2007. There have been some important contacts in Brussels a few weeks ago at the level of ministers to prepare the summit. And the strategic objective from both the European Union and India is to get a free trade agreement between those two parties as soon as possible. And let me just mention that in the area of free trade agreements, things are moving quite fast around India and around the EU. The EU has, as you may know, now a free trade agreement with Korea, which entered into force in 2011. In December, the EU agreed a free trade agreement with Singapore, which is now being ratified. Just last week, the Prime Minister of Thailand was in Brussels. They agreed that there would be an FTA with Thailand. They're being negotiated with a number of other ASEAN countries. And one big FTA which is in the pipeline is between the EU and Japan, which will be formally confirmed when we will have an EU summit with Japan in the near future. These are EU bilateral, but of course there are also a number of multilateral trade agreements being discussed, and I'm sure some of the panelists will discuss this, the TPP, the ICEP, and most recently, as you may know, the EU and the US have announced that they will also work on a transatlantic free trade agreement. My final point, because the title of today's lecture is that the EU is in crisis, let me just remind you that the EU is in crisis, but we are dealing with it. And as I speak, ministers are meeting in Brussels. Let me also remind you that the EU is still the world's largest economy. It is the largest trading bloc in the world, and it is the largest internal market in the world. And that's also why a number of third parties are quite interested in having trade agreements and trade with the EU. The European Union has among the highest GDP in the world and remains committed to free trade, despite the problems that we may have with the sovereign debt crisis. I think this is very important. In fact, at the European Council in February, last time Mr. Van Rompuy chaired the Council, the whole area of trade was on the agenda. And of course, as we try to solve the crisis with structural reforms, cutting the budgets, some countries, of course, it's very tough, austerity, you see a high unemployment. But at the same time, the European Union is working on getting more growth to Europe, and of course in that context trade and free trade comes in. So the European Union is still very much in favor of free trade. Let me also mention, because we are in Asia, and sometimes we forget that the European Union is the largest donor of development assistance in the world, including in Asia. There are still a lot of poor people in Asia, which sometimes if we're in Singapore, maybe we forget it, but when we travel outside Singapore, we are reminded of that. So there's still a lot of development assistance being given to Asia. And the European Union is a leader in sustainable development, environmental awareness, and tackling climate change. I thought I just wanted to give you this little framework for the discussion, and I'm sure we will have interesting discussions. So where do we start? Do we start to ISAS? Yes. So I'll
Back and forth.
Back and forth. So I have to be very neutral tonight. I'll hand over the microphone to Professor Harris, and
oh, okay. Right.
Each of you will speak for about 10 minutes. And at the end of the discussion, we will also hear a bit about the two institutes.
Right.
So without further ado,
okay.
You better have the microphone.
All right. I'm very grateful to you for introducing me and explaining that I'm a social anthropologist, and I'm not an economist. I'm not a finance person, so I feel in many ways that I'm not really the best person to be sitting up here. I think my sole qualification for being here is that I am a European. And actually, I interjected in the course of your introduction to say, oh, I'm English. And I really do feel very English, but I'm, I think, one of the relatively few people in England who would also say, I'm a European. Constructing a European identity is a process that I think hasn't gone nearly as far as it needs to. Anyway, I think that what I would like to contribute to this discussion, initially anyway, really follows from those introductory remarks about the EU. Because my first reaction on seeing the title of this discussion was actually to say, what crisis? You know, there's a great deal of hype about a crisis in Europe, but there are plenty of signals which point the other way. You know, a crisis in Europe, but isn't it interesting that the major European stock markets have been, you know, climbing rapidly over the first few months of this year? The FTSE, the Financial Times Stock Exchange Index, hasn't sort of hit a new ceiling in the way that the Dow did last week, but it's, you know, as somebody who has a pension in the UK, you know, I do kind of care about what's happening in the stock market, and the London stock market is looking much healthier today than it has at any time since January 2008. So, you know, something's going on that has given a real kind of upward push to stock markets in Europe. And also following from your remarks there about the strengths of Europe, the last time I saw any figures on this, I believe that 27%, am I right? 27% of reserves across the world are held in euros, and this is supposed to be a currency in crisis. The exchange rate of the euro against the dollar, much stronger than at the time the euro was formed. So it seems to me there are plenty of indicators of the strengths of the European economy. I also think that Europe has actually put in place the European Union. Actually, I should qualify that to say the countries which are part of the Eurozone in particular, but in the context, the framework of the European Union, have put in place, I think, the architecture for stability. It's clear that the European Central Bank has been ready to intervene and has built up the means through the European Stability Mechanism of intervening to ensure that the kinds of developments that took place in the recent past won't recur. The framework for a banking union is in place, and the Eurozone hasn't broken up. And I think that the indications are now very clear that it's not going to break up because of, as I said, the architecture of regulation and so on being in place to cope with crisis better than was the case in the recent past. And I think that there is no doubt about the commitments of Europe's leaders. I think the leadership in Europe has not been great over the last 2 or 3 years, but I think there's no doubt of the commitments of European leaders to the Eurozone and to the European Union. Of course, there is an ongoing recession, a very serious recession, especially in the southern European countries, and actually in many ways in the UK as well. I feel particularly about the recession in Portugal because I have a young colleague at Simon Fraser University who is currently the Minister for the Economy in Portugal. He's got bags of chutzpah and he really needs it in order to hold that job down as he has done now for getting on for 2 years. So there is unquestionably, there's a big crisis, especially in the southern European countries, and I think perhaps at the core of the problems of those economies now is a credit crunch. That it's extremely difficult, especially for the small businesses that generate most employment, to raise finance for their operations, except at very high cost. But I think that I don't know whether you would agree with me or not, but what I think I sense happening across Europe is a recognition that there's this difficult balancing act of dealing with deficits, but it's no good being so stringent as to cut off any prospects for growth. In relation to my own country, in relation to the United Kingdom, I find it very interesting that now we have The Economist, the Financial Times, saying to the finance minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Osborne, it's good on you for pursuing the course of sort of fiscal rectitude, but you've really got to do something about growth, about rekindling growth. And as some of you may have seen, The Economist just last week carried some advice to Mr. Osborne about how that might be done. So I think that's certainly one straw in the wind, but I see similar straws elsewhere in Europe. So I think I'd say at the beginning of this discussion, let's not get sort of too carried away with the notion of crisis, that the whole thing's going to sort of come tumbling down like a sort of house of cards. Just to sort of come on to Europe in relation to Asia, perhaps the last point that I should have made in relation to the EU is just to point out, or to remind us all, that one of the big priorities that President Obama has established for his new administration is to conclude a trade agreement with the European Union. Mr. Obama certainly hasn't given up on Europe, and if those negotiations reach a conclusion, in the reasonably short term, then the implications, it seems to me, for European growth, for American growth, and then for Asian economies are really potentially, I think, quite positive. Just lastly, maybe a word on the British position. I said at the beginning of my remarks that I do actually think of myself as a European, and I have always personally been a strong supporter of the United Kingdom taking the fullest possible, participating to the fullest possible extent in the European project. And to me, it is a matter of great regret that the backwoodsmen in the partly ruling Conservative Party are so antipathetic to Europe and have really, I think, tied the Prime Minister's hand in such a way as to have led him recently to commit to renegotiating Britain's position in Europe and then to hold a referendum on that renegotiated position. I think this is going to create uncertainty, which is certainly not in the interests of the United Kingdom, and I don't think it's in the interests of Europe either. I think that this was part, however, of the background to David Cameron's recent visit to India, with a whole sort of battery of business people, because of course part of the argument which is being put by those whom I described as the backwoodsmen in the Conservative Party is that there is an alternative sort of future for the UK through its relationships with the Commonwealth countries, through relationships outside Europe. And in that context, India is extremely important. Those in my country who think that, need to look a little bit more closely at the figures. I mean, I think British trade with Rhine-Westphalen is actually considerably more important than British trade with India. I think I've probably gone on long enough, haven't I?
Okay, we can come back later. Thank you very much, Professor. And now we move from one European, for the moment linked to ISAS, to an Indian linked to ESSEC, and Professor Chand